one of my professors, a philosophy professor I had, and I might need to check in with him to see what he thinks, especially if we end up going into World War III. But if he always said that, I mean, this is about 20 years ago, so just to give a time reference, that he never thought that America's downfall would be from another country conquering us, a la Red Dawn or
Yeah.
Man in the High Tower kind of thinking. It wasn't that somebody would conquer the U.S. That way, but the way that the U.S. would get conquered is economic downfall. And so I can see, so my bias, I guess, because I don't have Red Dawn type fears, that's how U.S. is going to get conquered. Um, this gentleman was very influential in my thinking. So when I'm hearing some of this Bitcoin stuff, I'm hearing some of this crypto, and based on some of the conversation we've had, it makes a lot more sense of how the U.S. might get itself put in a precarious situation with how we handle or don't handle cryptocurrency, much more than um, the worried about some kind of country coming onto our land and trying to take over and stuff.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, it's kind of like one of the biggest funders of US environmental groups is Russia. And that's because they compete in the energy and mineral market with us. So it's, you look at foreign influence, it's uh, China for years has been doing it with buying media, movies and stuff like that.
right,
And so if you're kind of a country participating in this and funding it, you have the ability to uh, kind of influence some of these things. Like there's a China expert I talked to a long time ago that said that China's long-term thought was that, like you said, America would destroy itself, and um, utilizing stuff like social media to create division in the United States is a good way to do that.
right,
So it's, I mean, it kind of, or flooding drugs into the country. Um, there's been a lot of, uh, well, let's just say that China hasn't been, like, a lot of fentanyl comes from China, and they haven't been super stringent on cracking down on a lot of the illegal drug making in the country. And it's, we just have it, it's our fault, right? As Americans, because we're the ones utilizing the drugs. It's a free choice
right.
to use drugs and get hooked. Well, maybe not a free choice to get hooked to it, but
I get what you're saying though.
yeah, but
Yeah,
it's US's downfall is not going to be from being invaded, or like by physical force, in my
right.
opinion. But you kind of make yourself susceptible to being invaded in different ways. And I would say Bitcoin isn't really um, isn't can't be comparable in that same manner. But there's a lot
Right.
of influential and special sphere of influence factors going into whether it be U.S. policy or otherwise. Um, and also, like, our declining birth rates, probably the biggest risk to the United States.
Hmm.
So
Yeah, and I don't necessarily mean Bitcoin specifically. I look at it more as kind of like this is, this is the first the rumblings or whatever. This is right before the Lusitania gets bombed. It's that kind of stuff. Where is this? It's not Putin going into Ukraine. It's some of this other stuff that's going to be our downfall. And I'm trying to also not do it in the world is ending kind of way, because in my studies in theology and philosophy, there's been so many times that people have said the world is going to end, and they mean the physical world was going to end, and it didn't. Or
yeah,
at least if it did, then we're in some kind of warped reality right now. But at the same time, there are paradigm shifts and stuff, and I can see. So if you'll indulge me a little bit to talk a little bit about postmodern philosophy, is that okay?
Sure.
Okay, you're just like I'll just edit it out later. It doesn't matter. So postmodern philosophy, for the most part, is not the it's not supposed to contradict modern philosophy, but it's supposed to be the end of modern philosophy. Like it's the changes and everything. It's taking modern philosophy to its highest extreme, and because of that, it shows the cracks in the system of modern philosophy. And this is, I mean, that's how classical philosophy basically got broken down. Is it got pushed to its extremes, and at its time when it was postmodern to go into the next time period of philosophy and stuff. Um, but postmodernity is kind of just saying, hey, we're hitting the extremes, and now when a world is capital, when capital is the main kind of thing that drives everything, that what can we do to no longer need to develop the systems, the frameworks of where capital has its value like it traditionally has. And so that's where I'm starting to see like, wow, we really are getting ready to hit a new version of what the world's going to be, at least in the
Yeah.
financial sphere, um, because we, a little bit more than 100 years ago, we put in labor laws, child labor laws, saying that we're not going to have children working and we're not going to put them in oppressive situations. And now any company, I'm assuming this is true in the energy finance. Well, I know it's true in the finance sector. No one's ever going to tell you you have to work 80 hours. It's completely voluntary.
Yeah.
They're not paying you comp time. They're not paying you overtime. But if you're not working the 80 hours or whatever the amount of hours are, then you're probably not going to last very long at the company to keep up with, the Joneses and whatnot. So I'm just kind of wrapping our minds around that, the fact that we feel like we don't, more so than ever, we don't have to treat our customer well to keep taking their money. We don't have to we don't have to follow some of the same rules that we did in the past to keep on exploiting the money. And based on some of the stuff I'm hearing with crypto as a whole, it's like basically the one thing that's holding it is that there's a faith in a specific society to be able to stand still. And because of all the things that are going on right now and the culmination of all the things that have happened over the past 150 years specifically, I mean, does it not feel like we're on the edge of the precipice of that something new is going to happen one way or another? I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's what I'm feeling, and that's the postmodern philosophy in a nutshell for what we're talking about.
Well, it's kind of like adapt or die, right? And
Right,
there's so like the Catholic Church, for instance, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, like those institutions live through everything because they adapt.
right,
And for every one of them, there's hundreds or thousands of things that haven't made it. I personally feel that a lot of the institutions that were built in the 20th century
hmm,
are really getting stretched to a point, like Social Security is for one.
right,
Like, is Social Security going to be around when we retire? Probably not. There's probably going to be something different, or there's going to have to be a giant recapitalization of it. So it's just kind of like, uh, and with like the declining population too, like countries grow because there's more younger people paying into a system than there is older people.
hmm,
And when that flips on its head, something has to change, otherwise it breaks.
right.
So it's just kind of a really it's a big time of change. And I feel like, you look out 15, 20 years from now, there's going to be a huge shift in how we do things, how our institutions work.
Right. And I think I think the shift is going to, like, it's going to seem all of a sudden,
Yeah.
but there's rumblings of that shift now. And that's one reason, honestly, that's one of the reasons why I want to do this kind of stuff with you, for this podcast and stuff, because I've not necessarily done it on the financial side or looking at it through those lenses. But when I worked in the church world, we were always worried, like, how do you adjust to the next generation, or the next the common thought and stuff? How do you
Changing
reach
times.
people?
Yeah.
Yeah. How do you continue to adapt and stuff? But it's, I mean, it's scary in one sense, and maybe in a good sense. It's a good scary, like, I remember solidly when I first had a checking account. I had one ever since I was young. My parents got that for me, and that was such a big deal, of having a checking account and using my SCS card.
Huh.
And every time I used it, it took, a dollar, from my account, because I used my SCS card. But that was the cool thing, is I could get my money, um, from a machine. And so if I didn't have to carry it in my wallet all the time. And then a few years later, the fact that you could have a personal debit card, that did not charge you money for most transactions. I mean, there'd still be a couple places, and 7-Eleven was unique as being like the only place you could withdraw money without a fee. And how that was becoming such a big deal that 7-Eleven did that. But the fact that we'd had our own personal debit card, and no longer relying on checks, no longer, I mean, this has literally happened in my lifetime of
Yeah.
what the changes that can come. I mean, I remember, and if my mom ever hears this, she'll probably remember this too. But we were desperate for cash for whatever reason, and we lived in Bethany at the time, and there was the one of the banks. They had an SCS machine that you could access after hours. And that, again, that was a huge deal in the mid '80s, of a bank having access to your money after 5 p.m.
Huh.
or on the
Yeah.
weekends. I don't think people remember some of that or realize how drastic it was. And if you put your card in 3 times and it declined, it basically ate your card. Like, you had to go to the bank to get a new card, and it was a huge process that would take months. And so I remember her being desperate, typing in the PIN number or whatever to try to get out, like, however much money we needed at the time. And she did it twice and it declined. And there was this kind of like, do I or don't I put it in a third time? Because I know
Yeah.
we have the money. And then I think, and honestly, I don't remember. I don't remember if we just went and got my dad and then used his card, or if we tried one more time and it just happened to work. But but that was the reality. I mean, that is reality, and that was considered fancy back in the '80s, and now we literally, like, when I say we, I mean like most individuals that have any kind of job, you don't get a check that you go deposit anymore. It's automatically electronically transferred, which was considered such a cool new thing back in 2000 when
Hmm.
I remember my first job. That's like, well, we can do an electronic deposit, and I'm like, cool.
Huh. Perfect.
I mean, the fact that you had a bank account, I mean, that was something that not everybody had a bank account. I mean, I guess people still don't, and I don't know how that works because I'm a privileged person now, but we trade on Amazon. We trade on
Yeah.
all these little companies, Netflix and stuff, and we don't even um, think about how difficult it would have been. Well, maybe not 10 years ago, but definitely 20 years ago or 30 years ago to do this. And that's changed dramatically. So
Yeah. It's
as you
pretty
said,
amazing.
in the next 15 years, I mean, well, heck, even the past 5 years, really, I'd say past 5 years, we've had smartwatches, doing a lot of stuff. And I'm kind of one of those guys that I'm doing everything possible to not get a smartwatch, because I'm afraid of what kind of person I'm going to be. But by then, we're going to have some other kind of thing that's even simpler than the smartwatch that will do all the stuff. I mean, I know it's already there, but I mean, it's going to be common, like regular people that you just go to work with, or I would say go to the movie theater, but our movie theater's going to be around in 15 years. It's just any kind of public place, you're going to see people with something. And they tried it with like the Google Glass and everything, and it didn't work quite at that time. But at the same time, I knew someone that had Google Glass, and and he loved it. Um, he didn't think that it was nearly as bad as all the bad reviews that came from it.
That's a
So
pretty cool idea.
I think that that something like that's gonna come back, and even be better than before. And in a different way, I remember in 2006 is when I officially graduated college. I took the 10-year plan, and my wife had already been graduated for a couple of years, and she's 3 years younger than me, just so that way to completely rub in how much smarter and brilliant she is. Where we went to the movie theater to go watch X-Men 3, the one with Juggernaut. Um, and while we were waiting in line, we had a special flip phone. I want to say it was Samsung, and the video screen was so small. It was like an inch by an inch. And we it was a special gift my parents gave us of that our cell phones could have video at all. And we'd watch these little things like from Jon Stewart or ESPN or something
Huh?
like that. And it was considered such great technology in 2006. So almost exactly 15 years ago, actually almost exactly 16 years ago to the day. Like we were watching movies in March of 2006. And now, if we pulled out a phone like that, you would just look at somebody weird.
But
That was
then you would
15.
be like, hey, do you have Snake on your phone? I love playing that game.
We can download it now,
Huh?
and you can pay for more in the App Store. So, I mean, 15 years, that was just 15 years ago. I mean, just a little bit more than 15 years ago. So, in 15 years from now, just thinking about how all the other technology, but then specifically in the financial sphere, I'm kind of worried that I'm going to get left behind, if I don't keep up with some of this stuff. And I know that's a lot of stories and everything, but all those things were gradual. They didn't just happen like that. But people, you take the Shawshank Redemption kind of mentality where Red goes in there, and when he comes out, the whole world's different.
Yeah.
Um, if someone was gone for the past 20 years, it's crazy. I mean, and what changes in the next 20 years, 15 years, 5 years, heck, 1 year? I mean, remember where we were 2 years ago?
Yeah.
About today, we were all quarantining and being scared to death. Um, in fact, I there's a video series. I might have to give you the link, and it's a lady who she does it comedically, where she checks back in on herself about every 3 to 6 months. Starts off in like January of 2020, and then she checks in like April 1st of 2020 to her January 2020 self. It's like, I'm not going to tell you anything about the future. And she's like, oh yeah, can you believe like Kobe died? And everybody's like, oh yeah, that was such a tragedy. And that World War III almost got started in January of 2020. And then she's like, oh yeah, I remember those. Yeah, that was kind of crazy. And she's like, wait a minute, you remember those? You're making it sound like something worse has happened. And then a couple months later, you have the George Floyd stuff, and
Yeah.
that version of her talks to the version from April, and it's like, uh, yeah, I remember when quarantining when that was the big scare, and then comes back 6 months later, and it's like, yeah, we're gonna have a vaccine, and then how
Time's
people have
moving
reacted
so
to the
fast.
vaccine, yeah, and this is within, I mean, if more time than any other in our lives especially, but I would say even people our parents or grandparents age, maybe the depression might be the exception, where time kind of stood still for the past 2 years, even though it didn't stand still at all. Like we're able to see so much more of what has been going on because so many people weren't allowed to do their day-to-day task. They were forced to slow down. They were forced to see the world, and yet we're picking up speed again. I mean, we still have some production companies that are behind, so our supply chain and stuff is kind of really wrecked. But I would say by this time next year, assuming something, crossing my fingers that World War III doesn't happen, that some of these other catastrophic type things don't happen. But next year at this time, we're going to be back at full force like we were in 2019, and maybe even further on. And it's going to be almost a blip of like, oh yeah, the pandemic, yeah,
Well, there will be
yeah.
something else that will replace it.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's always something, but it's just the time won't stand still like it has over the past 2 years.
Well,
Um,
I think it depends. my views too, like what is time?
Oh, don't
Uh,
even start
so because
that.
we
Next
could go
time.
we could go on a huge philosophical
Yeah,
discussion on this.
you just thought we were talking about energy and money. We're also talking about time.
Well, time like money is just a unit of value that someone came up with.
Yeah, yeah.
So
All right, so let's talk about the categorical imperatives from Immanuel Kant.
yeah,
Causation.
but yeah,
um,
I think it's going to be some interesting couple of years.